The morning sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the quiet streets of West Haven, a small suburban town where life moved at a predictable pace. Guardian State Bank's branch on Elm Street was no exception to this rhythm. At precisely 9:03 a.m., the automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, welcoming the first rays of light that danced across the polished marble floors. The air inside was crisp, laced with the faint scent of lemon polish from the overnight cleaning and the subtle hum of printers warming up in the back offices. It was a typical Wednesday, or so it seemed, with employees still settling into their routines, adjusting ties, sipping lukewarm coffee from disposable cups, and exchanging brief nods about the weather or last night's game. Elliot Dandridge, 63 years old and confined to a wheelchair since a car accident in his 40s, rolled through those doors without fanfare. He was a man who had long ago mastered the art of blending into the background. His slate gray windbreaker was zipped halfway up, revealing a simple button-down shirt beneath, and a faded baseball cap sat low on his brow, shadowing his sharp blue eyes. His face bore the lines of a life well lived, deep creases around his mouth from years of quiet smiles and furrowed brows from moments of deep thought. Elliot didn't carry himself like a man of importance. That was deliberate. He had built his empire in silence, acquiring stakes in businesses like Guardian State Bank through shrewd investments and a keen eye for potential. Owning a controlling interest in the bank wasn't something he advertised. It was a tool for observation, a way to ensure the institutions he backed upheld the values he cherished: dignity, respect, and quiet efficiency. As he navigated the lobby, his wheelchair's wheels whispering against the tile, Elliot took in the scene with practiced subtlety. The waiting area held a handful of early clients. A mother in her 40s with her teenage son, both scrolling through phones. An older gentleman in a flannel jacket flipping through a magazine. A woman in scrubs clutching a to-go coffee cup, likely on her way to a shift at the nearby hospital. The reception desk loomed ahead, manned by Megan Alcott, a mid-30s woman whose platinum blonde bob framed her face like sharp edges, complemented by thick mascara that accentuated her piercing gaze. Megan was known among staff for her efficiency. Her metrics were impeccable, but her sharpness often bordered on abrasiveness, a trait overlooked in favor of her performance numbers. Elliot approached the desk slowly, his hands steady on the wheels. He cleared his throat gently, his voice calm and measured. "Excuse me," he said. "Could I speak with the branch manager, please?" Megan glanced up from her computer screen, her eyes flicking over him for a mere second before returning to her task. She didn't smile. Instead, her lips pursed slightly, as if the interruption was an unwelcome intrusion on her morning. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her tone flat, not bothering to make full eye contact. "No, I don't," Elliot replied evenly, his expression unchanged, "but I'd appreciate a moment of their time." Before he could elaborate, Megan raised a palm in a dismissive gesture, cutting him off. She turned to her coworker, Betty, who was organizing forms nearby, and muttered under her breath, loud enough for Elliot and a few nearby ears to catch, "Probably here to cash somebody else's check or complain about something we can't fix." The words hung in the air like a sour note, not shouted but deliberate, slicing through the quiet lobby. A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. The teenage boy looked up from his phone, shifting in his seat, while his mother frowned, glancing between Megan and Elliot. The woman in scrubs paused mid-sip, her brow furrowing. Elliot, however, didn't flinch. He blinked slowly, tilting his head in what appeared to be mild surprise, but inside it was calculation. He had visited dozens of branches like this over the years, unannounced and unassuming, to gauge the true culture of his investments. Rudeness wasn't new to him, disability often invited it, but this was blatant, unfiltered by any pretense of professionalism. "I can wait," Elliot said calmly, his voice as steady as a still pond. "But I'd still like to speak with the branch manager." Megan sighed dramatically, as if the request was an outrageous burden. "Sir, unless you're a client here, I'm afraid the manager doesn't have time for walk-ins." Her words carried an edge, implying he was wasting her time. "I'm not here to make a withdrawal," Elliot answered, his tone patient. "Then what are you here for?" Megan shot back, her voice rising just enough to draw more attention. She leaned forward slightly, her manicured nails tapping impatiently on the counter. Before Elliot could respond, a man's voice cut across the lobby. "Is there a problem?" It was Eduardo, a Latino man in his late 40s, dressed in a crisp blue shirt with a name tag reading Client Services Representative. He had emerged from a side hallway, his tight lips and furrowed brow indicating he had heard enough. Megan didn't even glance his way. "I've got it, Eduardo." Eduardo didn't budge. "Miss Alcott," he said, lowering his voice, "you might want to lower your tone." "I said I've got it," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. Elliot looked at Eduardo for a long moment, nodding once in quiet appreciation. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes, recognition of decency in a moment of tension. Turning back to Megan, Elliot tried again. "Please, just the manager. That's all I'm asking." Megan rolled her eyes, grabbing a clipboard and slapping it onto the desk with unnecessary force. "Fine. Write down your name. Someone might get to you in an hour." Elliot didn't touch the clipboard. Instead, he calmly opened a leather folder resting on his lap, pulling out a tri-folded sheet of paper. The lobby seemed to hold its breath. The mother and son exchanged glances, the air thickening with unspoken tension. Megan leaned against the counter, pretending not to notice, but she turned slightly toward Eduardo, muttering, "I don't know why some people think demanding attention gets them somewhere." Eduardo crossed his arms, saying nothing, his gaze fixed on Elliot. Elliot took his time, unfolding the document deliberately. He wasn't flustered. If anything, he appeared resigned, as though this was a script he'd seen play out too many times. Sliding the paper onto the counter, he tapped it once. "I'd appreciate it if you could hand this to your branch manager." Megan scoffed. "Sir, we don't accept unsolicited paperwork. If this is about a complaint, we have an online. It's not a complaint." Elliot interjected evenly. "It's documentation. I already told you." She interrupted, her voice louder now. "You're not on the appointment schedule, so unless you're depositing something or seeing a banker, you can wait just like everyone else." A murmur stirred from the waiting area. The woman in scrubs whispered to the man next to her. "She's talking to him like he's a child." The older gentleman in flannel shifted, his face hardening. People were noticing, the room's energy shifting from indifference to unease. Megan, still oblivious to the change, shoved the paper aside with a fingernail. "If you're not going to sign in, I'm going to have to ask you to move out of the reception area." Elliot leaned back slightly in his chair, not retreating, but assessing. He turned to Eduardo. "Would you mind taking a look at this, please?" Eduardo stepped forward without hesitation. Megan tried to intervene. "He doesn't need to." But Eduardo held up a hand, firm and quiet. He picked up the document, scanned it, and his eyes widened. This is from corporate. Megan frowned. What? Eduardo backed up, rereading the bottom. I think you should get Brian now. Megan hesitated. For what? He's with now, Eduardo repeated, his voice unyielding. With a loud sigh, Megan grabbed the office phone, turning her back to the lobby as she spoke into it, her voice muffled. Elliot didn't watch her. Instead, he surveyed the room. Clients were no longer pretending not to listen. Some stared openly. The older man in flannel gave him a small nod. The woman with the purse clutched it tighter but didn't look away. The teenager pulled out his phone, texting furiously, his eyes fixed on the scene. Megan hung up. He'll be out when he can, she muttered, stepping away as if to distance herself from the mess. Elliot glanced at Eduardo. Thank you. Eduardo nodded slightly. We don't get many visits from corporate. I didn't recognize you, sir. That's the idea, Elliot replied. Megan heard him this time, really heard him. Corporate? She repeated, her tone flatter, cautious. You work for Guardian State. Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he rested his hands on his wheels, his posture calm but expectant, as if waiting for the pieces to fall into place. Megan paced behind the counter, arms folded, her smugness cracking into brittleness. The lobby felt heavier, the air thick with anticipation. Terence Holland, a young teller in his 20s, paused mid-transaction at his station, excusing himself from an elderly client. He leaned against the partition, eyes on Elliot, and discreetly pulled out his phone, hitting record after a moment's hesitation. The teenager whispered to his mom, "Mom, is he like some kind of undercover boss?" She glanced at Megan, then back. "He doesn't need to be undercover. Look how quiet she got all of a sudden." Megan wasn't talking anymore, glaring at Eduardo, who ignored her, typing at his desk. The front doors opened again, and a middle-aged woman in a power suit, Judith Emery, a long-time regional investment client, entered, pausing as she sensed the tension. She spotted Elliot, considered for a moment, then approached the desk. Megan perked up. "Hi, welcome to Guardian State. I can help you in just a..." "I'm not here for a transaction," Judith said, stepping to Elliot. Bending slightly, she spoke softly. "Mr. Dandridge, I didn't know you'd be here today." He smiled faintly. Neither did she. Judith locked eyes with Megan. "Is that so?" Megan opened her mouth but faltered. Judith straightened. "I'll be waiting over there. I was told you'd be making a visit sometime this month. Glad I happened to be here." She looked around. "I see you're already making an impact." Elliot chuckled softly, unintended but noted. Judith walked to a chair, pulling out her planner. Terence stopped recording. The air had shifted. This was no longer a confrontation, but a reveal. Megan returned to the desk, slower now. "I didn't know," she said, staring at the counter. "I didn't know who you were." "That's the point," Elliot replied gently. "Would you have spoken to me differently if I looked the same, but wasn't someone important?" The question lingered unanswered as the room fell silent. Keyboards stopped clattering, conversations halted. Terence glanced at Eduardo, who watched quietly. Megan said nothing. Then the hallway door clicked open. Brian Covington, the branch manager, stepped out, a tall man in his early 50s with streaked gray hair and a loosened tie. His eyes assessed the room, landing on Megan first, then Elliot. Recognition flickered. "Mr. Dandridge," Elliot nodded. Brian extended a hand. "I wasn't told you'd be visiting this location today." "I like to keep things simple," Elliot said. "Surprise visits help me see things for what they really are." Brian nodded slowly. "Understood." Megan looked between them, confusion dawning. "Wait, he's not just from corporate." Brian turned to her, expression tight. "Megan, we'll speak later." She swallowed hard. "I just didn't." He cut her off with a glance. "Mr. Dandridge, would you like to come into my office?" Elliot motioned to the counter. "I already submitted a document that explains why I'm here." Brian took the paper from Eduardo, scanned it, his jaw clenching. "Follow me, please." Elliot nodded, wheeling toward the hallway, but paused to look back at Megan. "I assume you have cameras in this branch?" "Yes, sir," Brian said. 6-point coverage, synced to the internal server. "Good," Elliot replied. "I'd like to review this morning's footage before we continue." Brian's face tightened. "Absolutely." Megan stepped forward, voice cracking. "Mr. Dandridge, I didn't mean anything. I just didn't know." Elliot studied her. "You meant exactly what you said. That's the problem." He wheeled down the hallway, leaving Megan shrinking under the weight of watching eyes. Judith whispered from her seat, disappointed. Terence put his phone away. The truth was louder than any video. In Brian's office, the door closed softly. "Would you like anything? Coffee? Water?" Brian asked. "No, thank you," Elliot said. Brian sat, opening his laptop. "I'll cue up the footage now." They watched in silence. The entrance, Megan's words, Eduardo's intervention, the shifting crowd. "I need a copy sent to legal," Elliot said. "Already done," Brian replied. "The moment Eduardo brought me the paper, I knew." "I'm not trying to fire people," Elliot said softly, "but I also didn't come here to be spoken to like a street beggar." "I understand," Brian said, rubbing his neck. "There are things we've overlooked. I've let Megan slide before. Sharp tongue, decent performance, but today, this was something else." The footage played on, Megan's voice clear. Outside, the lobby stirred with hushed tones, a silent message spreading. Things were changing. The air in the Guardian State Bank's West Haven branch felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the morning's events and were holding their breath alongside the people inside. The lobby, though still functional, buzzed with a subdued energy. Clients moved through their transactions with quieter voices, and employees exchanged glances that carried questions no one dared to ask aloud. The automatic doors continued to hiss open and shut, admitting the occasional gust of late summer air, but the rhythm of the branch had shifted. It was no longer just another Wednesday. It was a day that had cracked open, revealing the fault lines beneath the polished surface of routine. Elliot Dandridge sat in Brian Covington's office. The door closed, but the weight of the lobby's attention seeping through the walls. The office was a small, orderly space. A mahogany desk, cluttered with papers, and a coffee mug that read World's Okayest Manager. A filing cabinet in the corner, and a single window overlooking the parking lot where sunlight glinted off windshields. The hum of the laptop filled the silence as the security footage looped on the screen, replaying the moment Megan Alcott's words had sliced through the room. Elliot watched without expression, his hands resting lightly on his lap, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail. The tilt of Megan's head, the way Eduardo's shoulders stiffened, the subtle shift of clients turning to watch. Brian leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. He was a man accustomed to managing crises, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about a single employee's misstep. It was about the culture he'd allowed to fester under his watch. "I've sent the footage to legal as requested," he said, his voice steady but laced with the fatigue of someone who knew the day wasn't over. "They'll have it by noon." Elliot nodded, his gaze still on the screen. "Good, but this isn't about paperwork or procedures, Brian. It's about what I saw out there." Brian swallowed, his throat tight. "I know. I've been here 10 years, and I've seen my share of tense moments. But what happened today?" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I should have caught this sooner." Elliot turned his chair slightly to face him. "Why didn't you?" The question wasn't accusatory, but it landed like a stone. Brian hesitated, his fingers pausing mid-drum. Megan's numbers were always strong. Clients liked her when she was on closed deals, moved accounts. The complaints, they were never formal, just whispers. I thought she'd grow out of it. Grow out of treating system, etude? Elliot asked, his voice calm but pointed. Brian shifted uncomfortably. "I thought her performance outweighed the occasional attitude. I was wrong." Elliot leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Performance doesn't excuse treating people like they're beneath you. Numbers don't make a culture, people do." The words hung in the air, simple but heavy. Brian nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "You're right. I let the metrics blind me." Outside, the lobby was a different world. Megan stood by the reception desk, her arms crossed tightly, her face a mix of defiance and dread. She hadn't moved since Brian and Elliot disappeared into the office, as if staying rooted to the spot might somehow anchor her against the storm she'd unleashed. Her badge still hung from her blazer, but it felt like a prop now, a relic of a role she was beginning to realize might no longer be hers. The other employees went about their tasks, but their movements were mechanical, their glances fleeting but loaded. Eduardo, stationed at his desk, typed with deliberate focus, avoiding her eyes. Terence Holland, the young teller who had recorded the exchange, stood near the teller booths, fidgeting with a paperclip, his phone now back in his pocket, but the weight of what he'd captured still lingering. The clients in the waiting area were no less affected. The mother and her teenage son, who had whispered about Elliot being an undercover boss, sat quietly, their earlier curiosity replaced by a somber understanding. The woman in scrubs, whose name was Carla and who worked the night shift at West Haven General, sipped her coffee, her mind replaying Megan's tone, the way it had cut deeper than words should. The older man in flannel, Mr. Fairley, a regular who'd been banking there for 2 decades, sat with his magazine closed, his hands folded, watching the scene like a man who'd seen too many days like this, but never one quite so raw. Judith Emery, the regional investment client, remained seated by the window, her planner open but untouched. She'd known Elliot for years, having met him at a corporate event in Chicago a decade ago. His quiet demeanor had struck her then, not flashy like the other investors, but deliberate, listening more than he spoke. She'd recognized him the moment she walked in, not by his appearance, but by the way he carried himself, like a man who didn't need to announce his presence. Now, watching the fallout, she jotted notes in her planner, not about investments, but about the morning, as if documenting it might help her process the shift she felt in the room. Megan's pacing had slowed, her nails no longer tapping but digging into her sleeves, a nervous tic she hadn't noticed herself developing. She muttered to herself, barely audible, "This is ridiculous. I was just doing my job." But the words felt hollow even to her. She glanced toward the hallway, waiting for Brian to emerge, hoping for a chance to explain, to salvage something. She hadn't meant to be cruel. She told herself that. It was just a busy morning, a long week, a life that never seemed to give her a break. But the faces around her, the ones avoiding her gaze, told a different story. Terence, still near the teller booths, finally moved, walking back to his station. He wanted to return to the rhythm of deposits and withdrawals, to the comfort of numbers that didn't judge. But he couldn't shake the image of Elliot's calm, steady presence, the way he'd absorbed Megan's words without flinching. Terence had recorded the exchange on instinct, thinking it might matter later, but now he felt a pang of guilt, not for recording, but for hesitating, for not speaking up in the moment. He glanced at Eduardo, who met his eyes briefly and nodded, a silent acknowledgement that they were both caught in something bigger than themselves. The hallway door clicked open, and Brian emerged, his face set in a way that made Megan's stomach drop. Elliot followed, his wheelchair moving smoothly, his hands steady on the rims. Brian held a small folder under his arm, his tie still loosened, his glasses still tucked into his pocket. He walked straight to Megan. "Come with me, please." "Why? What are you?" she started, but his tone stopped her cold. They disappeared into the back, the door closing with a soft thud that echoed in the quiet lobby. Elliot wheeled into the center of the room, scanning the faces, some embarrassed, some curious, one or two ashamed. He didn't speak, not yet, but his presence was enough to hold the room's attention. Judith closed her planner, her lips tight, her eyes carrying a quiet disappointment that needed no words. Terence approached Elliot hesitantly. "Mr. Dandridge," he said, his voice low, "you were recording earlier, weren't you?" Elliot nodded, not accusingly. "I saw." Terence cleared his throat. "I thought it might help in case she denied it." "You can delete it," Elliot said. "The lesson's already here." Terence blinked, surprised. "Sir, there's no need," Elliot said. "The truth's loud enough." Terence nodded, deleting the clip with a few taps. "I wasn't sure what to do. She outranks me. I didn't want to get involved." "You did fine," Elliot said. "The hard part isn't speaking up. It's knowing when to stay calm and let the truth show itself." Nearby, the teenage boy whispered to his mother, "He's not what I expected." She smiled softly. "That's the point, baby. People never are." In Brian's office, Megan stood rigid, her arms still crossed, her polished exterior cracking. Brian placed the folder on his desk, opening it to reveal surveillance stills. Her face in every frame, her expression unmistakable. "I want to be very clear," he said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't just a review. This is documentation." Megan's voice cracked. "You're not serious. I'm not playing. Do you know how many people saw what happened out there?" Brian asked. "This isn't about not knowing who he was." "I didn't know," she said, desperation creeping in. "If I had—" "Stop," Brian said flatly. "You think the problem was not knowing he was corporate or an owner? You think it's acceptable to speak to anyone that way?" "I didn't mean it," she muttered. Brian leaned forward. "You meant every word. You just didn't mean to be caught." Megan's mouth opened, but no sound came. She looked smaller now, her armor failing. "You're really letting me go." "Not because he told me to," Brian said. "Because I should have done this sooner." She stared, searching for mercy that wasn't there. "I need your badge and login credentials," he said. Her hands shook as she unclipped her badge and set it on the desk, then typed her deactivation code into the iPad. "He humiliated me," she said, voice barely a whisper. "No," Brian said calmly, "you did that to yourself." Megan took a slow breath, turned, and left without another word. Back in the lobby, her absence was immediate. Her coat folded over her arm, her eyes avoiding everyone as she walked out. The door clicked shut behind her, and the room exhaled. Elliot looked up at Brian. "All done?" Brian nodded. "I'd like to speak to the team," Elliot said. Brian gathered the staff: Eduardo, Terence, a young woman from loans, 2 tellers, even the janitor, Clarence Duval. They formed a semicircle near the waiting area, uncertain but attentive. Elliot's voice, when he spoke, was steady, carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of lessons. "I didn't come here to trap anyone," he began. "I came to see how people are treated when they look like they have nothing to offer. Today, I wasn't addressed as a client, a man, or a human being. I was spoken to like an inconvenience. The silence was thick, every word landing like a stone. I've spent my life being underestimated, dismissed, looked past. He continued, that's fine. I don't need attention, but you saw something wasn't right. He looked at Terence. You pressed record. That takes something. Terence flushed. I didn't know what else to do. That's okay, Elliot said. You acknowledged it. That's enough. He turned to Eduardo. You spoke up, not to protect me, but because it was right. That means more than you know. Eduardo nodded, overwhelmed. I thought I'd get written up. Maybe in another bank. Elliot said with a faint smile. Not this one. To the group, he said. The way you treat a person when you think they can't help you. That's the version of yourself the world remembers. You don't have to be perfect, but you have to try. Judith wiped a tear from her eye. Elliot's words weren't about punishment. They were about possibility, about building a place where trust was the foundation. The Guardian State Bank's West Haven branch had settled into an uneasy calm by late morning, but the air still carried the weight of what had transpired. The automatic doors hissed open and shut, admitting clients who moved with a cautious awareness, as if stepping into a space where something sacred had been disturbed. The marble floors gleamed under the sunlight streaming through the tall glass windows, but the usual hum of a bustling bank was subdued, replaced by a quiet that felt earned, deliberate. The staff moved through their tasks with precision, but their eyes darted toward one another, searching for cues on how to proceed after the morning's upheaval. Megan Alcott's absence was a presence in itself. An empty chair at the reception desk, a clipboard untouched, a name badge no longer clipped to a blazer. Elliot Dandridge remained in the lobby, his wheelchair positioned near the center, where he could see the entire room without drawing attention to himself. His slate, gray windbreaker was still zipped halfway, his baseball cap casting a shadow over his face, but his presence was undeniable now. The clients who had witnessed the earlier confrontation, Carla in her scrubs, Mr. Fairley in his flannel, the mother and her teenage son, lingered longer than necessary, as if waiting for the story to resolve itself. Judith Emery, the regional investment client, sat by the window, her planner closed now, her gaze alternating between Elliot and the staff, her expression a mix of respect and quiet anticipation. Brian Covington stood near the hallway door, his arms crossed, the folder containing the surveillance stills tucked under his elbow. He had just dismissed Megan, a decision that felt both inevitable and heavy. He was a man who prided himself on reading people, on keeping the branch running smoothly, but today had exposed cracks he hadn't fully acknowledged. He glanced at Elliot, who was speaking quietly with Clarence Duval, the janitor who had worked at the branch for over 30 years. Clarence, with his slow, deliberate movements and weathered hands, stood out in the polished environment, yet his presence grounded the room in a way few others could. "Sir," Clarence said, his voice low but steady, "I just want to say thank you for how you handled this." Elliot turned slightly in his chair, meeting Clarence's eyes. "And what's your name?" "Clarence Duval." "Pleasure to meet you, Clarence," Elliot said, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. Clarence looked down, then back up, his voice wavering but firm. "Been working here since they opened. 30 years, maybe more. I've seen people come and go, promoted who didn't know how to look others in the eye." He didn't say Megan's name, but the implication was clear. "I've cleaned up after folks who thought they were too good to say hello. That kind of thing stays with a man." Elliot nodded slowly. "Respect doesn't come from a title." "No, sir," Clarence replied. "It sure doesn't. Terence Holland, the young teller who had recorded the morning's events, watched from his station, his hands still but his mind racing. He hadn't expected to be part of this moment, hadn't expected to feel the weight of it so deeply. The woman from the loan's desk, Sarah, stepped forward hesitantly, her voice soft. "I didn't know what to say earlier, but I saw what happened. I should have said something." Elliot looked at her, his gaze gentle. "And now you have—" Sarah blinked, surprised by the absence of judgment in his tone. The room seemed to exhale, clients and staff alike processing the morning in their own ways. The mother and son began gathering their things, but they moved slowly, as if reluctant to leave. Mr. Fairley stood, his magazine tucked under his arm, and gave Elliot a small nod before heading toward the door. Carla, the nurse, finished her coffee and slipped out, but not before whispering to Judith, "That man's got more power in his silence than most do with a megaphone." Judith smiled faintly. "That's Elliot Dandridge for you." As the lobby began to clear, Elliot wheeled toward the front doors, but Terence caught up to him. "Mr. Dandridge," he said, his voice a little breathless. "I was wondering, would you be willing to come back, not to inspect us, but to talk to the new hires, maybe the interns? I think people would benefit from hearing you." Elliot paused, considering. "That's not my job, son." "I know," Terence said quickly, "but I think it matters." There was something in Terence's voice, not flattery, but conviction, that made Elliot pause. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Terence nodded, a small smile breaking through. "Thank you for today." A woman, one of the clients who had been waiting earlier, stepped forward to hold the door for Elliot as he approached the exit. She didn't do it out of obligation or pity, but out of simple decency. "Have a good day, sir," she said. "You too," Elliot replied, his voice soft as he rolled through the doorway and down the ramp into the parking lot. Inside, the branch began to settle back into its rhythm, but it was different now. Brian gathered the staff in the break room, a small space with vending machines and a table cluttered with coffee filters and sugar packets. Eduardo, Terence, Sarah, the two tellers, and even Clarence stood in a loose circle, their faces a mix of uncertainty and resolve. Brian spoke softly, his usual commanding tone softened by the day's events. "Let's make sure we never need a reminder like that again." No one responded, but the silence was agreement enough. They dispersed to their stations, each carrying a piece of the morning with them. Terence greeted his next client with direct eye contact, his usual shy demeanor replaced by a quiet confidence. Sarah asked her client 3 times if they needed anything else, her voice warmer than usual. Eduardo lingered near the front desk, not hovering but watching, ensuring the space felt welcoming. In the break room, Clarence pushed his mop across the tile, pausing to look out the window at the parking lot where Elliot had disappeared. There was a lightness to his face, a quiet satisfaction that hadn't been there before. He'd seen many days in this branch, but this one felt like a turning point, a moment when the invisible became visible. By late afternoon, Judith had made a call to corporate, her voice steady as she recounted the morning's events. "I've worked with Guardian State for a long time," she said, "and today I saw something I hope you never forget. Your people don't need more training, they need more listening." Her words, precise and unembellished, would later circulate through the upper offices, a quiet call for change. The teenager from earlier returned after school, clutching a $5 bill. He approached Terence's counter, his expression earnest. "I just wanted to say I thought that guy was cool. I liked how he didn't yell." Terence smiled. "Me too. I want to open an account here," the boy said, sliding the bill across the counter. Terence handed him a pen. "Best decision you'll make today." As the sun dipped, casting long shadows across the lobby, the branch took on a golden glow. Clarence turned off the floor buffer, Eduardo locked his drawer, and Terence double-checked the counters. Brian stepped into the center of the lobby, the sealed envelope from Elliot still in his locked drawer. He looked around, his voice low but clear. "This branch can be better. Let's make sure it is." The day ended as it had begun, with the hiss of automatic doors and the hum of a bank in motion. But it wasn't the same. Something had shifted, not in policy or procedure, but in perspective. Elliot Dandridge hadn't come to punish or preach. He'd come to observe, to listen, and, when necessary, to teach. The lesson wasn't about power or status. It was about dignity, about the way people treat one another when they think no one's watching. And in that quiet, unassuming branch on Elm Street, everyone had learned something they wouldn't soon forget.
If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.